Michael, do you want to just tell us really quickly? I'm going to pan over to the Exchange logo. What you're doing here and what this project is?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I mean, this project is an extension of a whole series of projects I do around kind of, well, thinking about the context around craft and what we do and how it has value in community and social situations. I always like to present this question like, have you used a cup today? Like have you used a cup today?
I have. For
you
my
have.
Tea in the morning.
I know, it's amazing.
Yes.
So that the idea that it is something so embedded in culture that it's a very unique way for me to move ideas then into culture, and in a variety of ways I do that. So it's no longer just about the aestheticized something at the end, and it's very simple that you can create a currency. You can actually mint your own currency. If people trust it, they'll actually yes, that's and I'll show you a little coin.
Great.
So and they're wooden, right? And that this kind of economic or this currency is backed by effort rather than gold. And so I've made 100 cups, and then over in the gallery space as well, I have a studio set up where I'll be making more cups because as cups leave, I need to kind of replenish the supply, right? So to perpetuate the system, I've asked folks in Asheville to think about what their talents are, what are the things they really care about, to kind of in some way a gesture of 5 to plus hours of effort into Asheville, and it's things that people might already be doing. One gentleman who I think it's so amazing, who will be posting about this, has been doing this project where he goes to a women's prison and has them read bedtime. They read bedtime stories, which he records and then brings to their children at home. And those kinds of stories need to, I think, be told. So this, an effort like that, you would come in and document and write down what you're doing. I exchange that for some of this currency. It's sort of a symbolic kind of exchange.
Well, I like that you mentioned that actually, because I was thinking about that in terms of it is more of a symbolic exchange because the currency it can only be used for the cup itself, right? So it's more about the idea than but I mean, I was kind of thinking about that in terms of labor, and so is that something that you're kind of critiquing in a way as well? Just do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah. Well, one thing, there's lots of layers. I would say that nobody's, and this is the stuff I'm glad you're asking about, because one of the initial reasons I did this project is that we are always asked as artists to donate our time and effort and labor. And I thought, well, why don't we create the nonprofit that does, like why don't we take our effort and labor and then express that into community in a way that we want to do that. So in a way that is a criticism of that whole, and I love to give. I mean, I'm out, but we're continually asked to donate work. There's that element, but also the idea, and Shantanu, who's been a collaborator for this whole project, he's actually working right now.
That's true.
He's doing the final bits. I talked about this today, but that the idea that, of course, so when we bring together 100 different people who are doing 100 different kinds of things in the community, there's an equity there, whether it's design work, or whether it's sweeping an alleyway, that there's a kind of equity around the kind of payment for that. And of course that fits into my own politics.
So one of the things that you mentioned in your kind of artist statement, or you call it a philosophy, which I actually like too, you say that these projects seek to enable object history through experiments in conceptual function. And I was wondering if you might talk about that. What does it mean to enable object history?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. Amazing that you would bring this up, a topic. So what's interesting about it, we all know that we live with objects that have a connection to some sort of, oftentimes the things we own are connected to something, a moment that we acquired it, the moment, they're imbued with things. Now it's very personal. But understanding that as a maker, I think is really valuable. I have a project with one single cup that's traveling through the hands of religious leaders. So moving this cup into the space of these religious leaders is different than me moving into that space. And I love that the cup can, in fact, in that case, be like a piece of journalism in a way. And what that enables me to do is, if I'm, rather than just forming the object, what I'm thinking about is how can I imagine how this cup could exist in the future, and then find ways to make that happen, that the object becomes an artifact. rather than just a symbol of something. So rather than creating a cup that symbolizes that faiths could actually have conversations together, I use the inherent function of that object to make that happen.
So I'm also just sitting here listening to you, and this is kind of fascinating because what the projects that I went over on your website and then what you're going to be doing here, it seems like your practice as a whole is sort of amassing this giant archive of
Definitely.
That's based around an object, but and reliant on it, but also shifting the emphasis away from the object in a way as well.
Yeah, and I think, so this is the thing that artists typically have a difficult time with. And here's how I think about it. So I want to sit down with you and nerd out for a while at some point. Like every other field, we should be iterating new ways and new ways that we acquire, new ways that what we make moves into the world. We should be spending as much energy there as on the kind of, like, how good can a cup become?
Well, I think
like, I know that's where I get in trouble.
No, but I think this is so interesting as well because a couple of friends we were talking about this project and thinking about, just as I had asked you earlier, so really it's symbolic, and the cup is just sort of a part of the symbol that will be attached to the currency, and it is the cup, right? So, but that's a really good point because it's not really so much about what use one has for a cup in exchange for the volunteerism that they're doing. It's more this kind of cyclical kind of engaged sort of activity, I guess. Is the exchange intended to be even based upon hours volunteered equating to labor?
So this is this is where I'm going to contradict myself, which is awesome.
We always do that.
Yeah, because that's, we live in duality, right?
Yeah.
So while I say you can't create a better object and make people care, now that I've gone down this avenue of creating different ways of people of acquiring, now I'm thinking about how do I deeply invest in the objects I make to match, to kind of honor that time.
Yeah.
And so I feel like this body of cups definitively is the best body of 100 objects I've ever made. At some level, there's been a shift in the way I've been making, from being a production potter to like saying, okay, I'm going to slow down a little bit with the amount of projects I do, and what I'm going to do is like really geek out on the object. Now, what that's doing is hopefully, and I think when you pick up a cup over there, really, there's 100 very uniquely different objects, and they have a very skin-like quality to the glaze. And so I've really thought about, okay, I've spent so much time on concepts that now I really need to honor that kind of making side. I guess this isn't contradicting. What's happened is, rather than the aesthetics driving the quality of the work, the idea has driven the quality of the work, which is aesthetic as well. But it's not for this. That's not for the purely like, I need to make this. It's not. It's a different path to get maybe to the same point.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing you saying is that you're really invested in thinking about this kind of exchange and what that means from your end and what it means from the exchanger's end. And so there's a very different sort of interaction between you and the object that you're crafting than there would be if you were mass producing a bunch of the same. Yeah.
And I'll talk about failure in that way. So when I first started doing the Misfit Cup project, which I talked about, they were like my production pots. They were like soda fired and kind of like manga soda pots, which I always have made. And then I realized that they had such an opinion that what I was doing is somebody would come in with a really tragic object, and I was just giving him this opinion back. Yeah. So what I started to do about 300 cups ago was to make a really far more in the kind of arena of these cups is a far more contemplative list. Like, how do I make a cup that listens rather than a cup that tells a story? So how do I make a cup that becomes a receiver of a moment rather than like shouting another opinion, like a wood-fired flashy cup seems to be just an opinion at that moment. Like, I love those. I have wood-fired flashy cups like I collect, but in that moment, I need to make an object. I need to create an aesthetic of an object for a completely different reason.
I have one sort of more question that's a little bit tough, I guess. One of the things that I found myself thinking about as well is, does the project unintentionally leave out certain members of the community that for whatever reason maybe can't contribute 5 hours of volunteer time?
Well, that's a really good question in that, now there's a reason why it's 5 and not 20. And there's a reason why there's a reason why in the language it doesn't say you must do.
Right.
There's a reason that we've used words like gesture and effort rather than volunteer.
That's true.
The reasons around that is to keep it accessible. Now, there's a certain point where, what do I say, a minute? Or what, like some people don't have time.
Yeah.
I get that. It's more about what I'm hoping happens, right? Is that some people won't maybe have time, and I get that, and some people may not even come into this space. But there's some stories that are going to be told of what people are doing, and I think this is where the value for me is, like in the end. Like the story of the gentleman who's doing the project in prisons, right? That I didn't know about that project, did you?
No.
No. And I think knowing about that project, also, when he first told me about this, it shifted even how I can give effort to a community. Like knowing that it's so simple, and it really did, like it's just like, I mean, you're just walking in and recording, and then mailing a tape to them. Like there's no real budget around it.
Yeah.
And it's not going to a volunteer agency and saying, I'm a retiree and have all this time. And that's the other part of what we didn't use. I wanted to avoid the word volunteer, because there's an association of volunteer, and that's around agency. Like, you know, I have time and ability to volunteer my time.
Absolutely.
But effort is different. Like roguely planting 9 bulbs of petunias around Asheville as this just quiet gesture would count.
I love that. I mean, and so basically this as a whole is a gesture.
Yeah.
And it will take, so whatever comes back into this will be a series of gestures, and so it's not, one gesture can't encompass everything. Right. So,
yeah, and the other part that I'm interested in, I think Shantanu, who slipped out, has been a full-on collaborator, and the whole staff here has really the center. But that we'll have these little gears that go together on the wall as people kind of bring their form up and fill it out. That these gears, one little gesture at a time, will form this kind of big engine, and actually moves. Sometimes the smallest gesture is sometimes the most powerful.
Oh, I agree, absolutely. And this has a whole month. I mean, people can participate throughout the month?
Throughout the month. I'm hoping that this is what we want. This is the start. Right. It might reach people that maybe have never been in this space, and that's one of my missions as a maker is not how do we speak to the same group of people over and over and over, but through interesting interactive things, how do we reach people that, the idea of giving an effort isn't really about art at that moment. And we're asking for participation that's not about we were looking for drawings in the gallery. It's we're looking for effort. Yeah. That might bring in new people. And I think that actually starts to address your question in a way too.
It does, yeah.
I think ultimately advocacy is what I am. Here's a really important, you ask these tough questions. I'm gonna ask myself a tough question, but I already have the answer. So I have a job. I'm a professor at the university and have this nice cushy academic thing. But I take that head on because I think that there is a really significant opportunity within academia to do the kind of weird research.
Yeah.
That it's important to recognize that I'm doing this kind of thing because I have the ability to do it right now. And that also gives you a luxury not having to monetize, but that's the point. From this, there's actually some things that can be, and I've been digging into this, where the service side of what we do can be a new way to think about making a living as a craftsperson. So advocacy for that and trying to build what that means in the future is important.